Thanks, everyone. So, nature. So we've had a lot of mention of nature today. So today I'll kind of touch on a lot of what was already said and maybe go into a bit more depth. So in terms of nature, we kind of all take nature for granted at times, but we have to imagine nature as it provides lots of services. And these can be broken down into our provisioning, regulating, and cultural services. So things like fisheries, genetic resources, medicines, pollination, temperature control, flood control, also sense of place, so these cultural services in terms of where we're from, the mental health and the well-being that we get from nature. So without nature, we are poorer for it. So I suppose, just to give some background, in 2019, the Dáil declared a national biodiversity emergency. We were one of the first countries in the world to do so. On foot of this, the National Citizens' Assembly on Biodiversity Loss was established. And this was 99 citizens selected across the country with one chair. And they made approximately 159 recommendations based on evidence provided to the Assembly. But one of the main statements that came out of the report was that the state's failure to address biodiversity loss, particularly with the lack of implementation enforcement of national biodiversity legislation. So in other words, the state was failing biodiversity. So I suppose, how did they get to that point? So there's just two graphs shown here, and some of these graphs have appeared today. So on the left, we've got our habitats that are protected under the EU Habitats Directive. And Ireland places 20th out of 28 countries. And so almost 85% of our habitats are in unfavorable condition. When we look at species then, about a third of our species, or just over a third of our species, are in unfavorable condition. And then if we look at our birds, in terms of the Birds Directive, most bird species are found to be in decline. And for example, in 2024, the NPWS published a report on the hen harrier, which has shown significant declines in the last few years. Both Article 17, which is Habitats Directive, and Article 12, which is the Birds Directive, were reported last in 2019, and these will get updates in 2025. So I suppose over the last few years, there's been a bit of a gap in terms of how our protected habitats and species have been doing. But if we look at what information has come out in that meantime, if we look at the birds of conservation concern, so this is a joint collaboration between Birdwatch Ireland and RSPB Northern Ireland, and they've shown that 26% of 200 of our bird species are now red listed, which means that they have high conservation concern. And particularly affected, as Jenny was saying earlier on, are breeding water birds, birds that use upland and farmland habitats. And I'll touch on some of the reasons for this, but most of it has to do with intensification of land and changes in land. If we look at plants, the BSBI, the Botanical Society of Britain and Ireland, produced an atlas for Ireland last year, and they found that over 50% of Ireland's native plants have shown a decline in range or abundance or both. And many of our habitats have been lost due to farming practices and forestry since the 1950s. Other pressures then relate to reseeding, over-fertilization, nitrogen deposition, herbicides, drainage, and changes in grazing pressure. So a whole suite of issues, but just to take home that over 50% of our native flora has declined. There's also the element of, I suppose, our protected species, but if we look at all of the other species we have in Ireland, so it's estimated there's around 31,000 species in Ireland at the moment. And of these, only 10% have had a conservation conservation status assessed. So what this basically means is 3,000 species have been assessed in Ireland for how they're doing. And if we look at it, the numbers are quite stark. So 14% of all the species assessed so far are threatened with extinction. Over 9%, or 273, are threatened with near extinction. So this basically means they're just on the cusp of being threatened. And then, unfortunately, from what we know of what we've looked at so far, 82 species have become extinct in Ireland over the last 100 years. And some of these range from the charismatic wolf, which disappeared in the late 18th century, right down to small insects like stoneflies and other small plants that have disappeared from bogs in the Midlands. So basically, there's an element there of what we don't know. So there's this whole range of biodiversity out there that we have no information on at all. We don't know how it's doing. So in terms of threats to biodiversity in nature, and Andy showed this slide earlier on, and it's very nuanced and it's very I suppose there's a lot of complexity in terms of direct and indirect drivers and how pressures and changes in government policy, demographics, and all these things affect. But ultimately, we can distill this down into 5 main threats. And that's land use change, overexploitation, pollution, invasive species, and climate change. So if we look at land use, as Fiona touched on it earlier, so we've seen lots of changes in land use in Ireland. And Ireland is predominantly a grass-based country. And the loss, removal, neglect, and change to hedgerows, stone walls, wetlands, ponds, all of these is reducing space for nature. Other practices such as pesticide use, fertilization, land drainage, while local in extent, again, reducing the amount of space our wild nature has. And if we look at the schematic here on the right, as we move from this heterogeneous landscape to a more homogeneous landscape, we reduce the amount of space, we reduce the amount of species, and we see a loss of biodiversity. Also, this fragmentation element. So as we homogenize our landscape, or we move to more intensive agriculture and urbanization, we break the connection between wild spaces. And this makes populations less resilient. So there's less movement between populations. So they're less resilient to any change. And when a population is less resilient to change, it's more likely to disappear. An example would be a barrier in a river, stopping fish migration. Overexploitation. So this is a major driver in Ireland. And some statistics around this. The Irish Peatland Council estimate that we've had a 77% loss in peatland in Ireland since the 1950s, mainly due to changes in land use. Land exploitation, so going back to land. So there's a paper in Nature in 2023 that showed that Ireland, or it estimated Ireland, had lost over 90% of its wetlands over the last, since the 1700s, again, due to urbanization, land use change, and land drainage. And then if we look at the marine, and I won't spend too long on the marine because Rob is going to talk about it, but we've seen declines in our many of our fish populations due to overfishing in the 1970s, 80s, and 90s. So much so that now they don't have a population large enough to replenish stocks. In terms of pollution, so there's been lots of talk about pollution today, so I won't talk too much about it. But deposition is a huge issue in terms of air pollution, consequences for species and decline in butterflies, bees, and other birds and insects. The loss of high-quality habitats. So, for example, the loss of our high-status rivers. Again, losing species like the pearl mussel, or salmon, or other and similar flora and fauna. So alien invasive species, so for anyone who doesn't know, these are species that originate from outside of Ireland that get in, whether accidentally or on purpose. And these have huge economic economic issues for countries. So much so that it's been estimated that in 2019, it cost over 400 billion euro that they cause that much economic damage. Also, they have issues for native wildlife to competition, so non-native species tend to have no competition. They don't have predation, they don't have pressure on them, so they can expand and outcompete native species quite easily. And then obviously habitat, so if we get invasive plants and other and similar, it reduces the amount of space for native fauna because they don't tend to associate with the non-natives. And then climate change, just to briefly touch on it, this is likely to change the geographic range of many of our native species. So an example here is the emperor dragonfly. So in the early 2000s, it was only known from the southeast coast. But due to climate change, warming temperatures, we now see last year that it's been found as high far north as the Inishowen Peninsula. So we're seeing, in the last 20 years, we're seeing direct effects of climate change on species distribution. But it will also, climate change will also aid invasives. So generally when we get invasives into the country, they come from warmer areas of the world. And as Ireland warms, these species are going to be able to get a foothold and thrive. We'll also see increased habitat degradation and fragmentation. We'll see increased intensity, magnitude, and frequency of fires, floods, storms, drought, all of these to have knock-on issues with our flora and fauna. And again, if we go back to these populations, if they're not resilient, any one of these issues will knock them out and reduce them. And the UN estimates that between 8 and 41% of species are at risk of losing half of their habitat due to increasing temperatures. So I suppose, what are we all doing about this? So if we go back, there's kind of a three-layer approach, a nested approach, and how biodiversity and nature are being addressed globally. So at a global level, we have the UN Convention on Biological Diversity, and we've got the UN Sustainable Development Goals. And within this, then, we have a regionally nested directives such as the biodiversity strategies, Water Framework Directive, Birds Habitat Directive, things like the new nature restoration law. And then on a national level, we'll have our National Biodiversity Action Plan, we'll have a water plan. We have things like the Forestry Programme, local county council biodiversity officer programme. So there is this layered and nuanced approach to biodiversity and nature in Ireland that are all producing plans of various scales and ambition. And if we look at Ireland in terms of its action plan, so this year, in 2024, Ireland produced its National Biodiversity Action Plan, which was the 4th one. And it's an all-of-government document that sets out the agenda for the next 7 or 8 years. And its key objectives are to adopt a whole-of-government, whole-of-society approach to biodiversity, meet urgent conservation and restoration needs, secure nature's contribution to people, enhance the evidence base for action on biodiversity, and to strengthen contributions to international biodiversity initiatives. And there's 194 actions laid out within this document. Other action plans then for nature across Ireland, there's a whole expanse of things. So there's the expansion of our national parks, for example. There's the All-Ireland Pollinator Plan run by the National Biodiversity Data Centre. We've EU-funded life projects, the corncrake, the pearl mussel, and there's many more of these coming on stream. European Innovation Partnerships. We've got ACRES, CAP, Peatland Action Plan. So there's Business for Biodiversity. There's loads and loads and loads of action plans for nature. But again, like it was mentioned by Andy earlier on, action plans are relatively easy to draw up. It's implementation that we need. And without implementation and on-the-ground action, we're not going to see improvement in biodiversity. And as we've seen over the last 4 or 5 years, even since the last update for protected species, we're seeing declines in our flora and fauna across the country. And just to kind of finish on a positive that shows that implementation works, if we look at corncrake. So in 2018, 2019, Corncrake Life kicked off, and in conjunction, MPWS started a corncrake breeding program. And we've now, in the last few years, we've seen the highest number of corncrake territories, up 45% in the last 6 years. Corncrake numbers have increased 35% since 2021. And this is across community involvement, where communities, farming organisations, local government, state government, and researchers are all working in collaboration, and it's well funded and well run, and we're seeing results. So it's just to show you that on the ground, targeted action does work. But I suppose, just to key up, all this work on the concrete, it's still vulnerable. So if all this stops tomorrow, the concrete will still likely decline and it will become extinct. So these have to be ongoing long-term projects. So just to kind of finalize, so these are our key messages that we took from nature, and I won't spend too long on these, but just to, in topic 1, basically, nature is not in a good place in Ireland. In terms of 2, we need policies, nature underpins much of what we do in our economy. It underpins our health, it underpins our food production. So we need to restore it and protect it. Biodiversity loss affects everybody, and we need to have plans and implementations and on-the-ground action that works. And then lastly, to finish, like we show with the concrete, and there are other examples, that if targeted action happens, we can see positive results. So just to acknowledge my co-authors, Tig and Deirdre Lynn from MPWS. I'd also like to thank the SOE team. And then this chapter was done with lots of input and lots of data from loads of organizations, and just to thank them for providing it all. So thank you very much.